The Police's 1983 Synchronicity tour grossed over $80 million, making them the biggest band in the world. Yet at their peak moment, breaking the Beatles' attendance record at Shea Stadium, Sting decided to end the band forever. Backstage, Stewart Copeland nursed a fractured rib from their latest physical fight. While 67,000 fans cheered unaware, they were witnessing both a coronation and a funeral. How did the most successful band in the world implode at their absolute peak? London, 1977. A dingy club with sticky floors and the sharp smell of cigarettes and beer. Three blonde men take the stage to indifference. Maybe 30 people in the audience, most talking over the music. "We'd play to empty rooms," Stewart Copeland remembered. "I'd look out and think, is this worth it? But something about our chemistry kept us going." These struggling musicians' punk appearance was purely strategic. They'd bleached their hair blonde for a Wrigley's chewing gum commercial that paid each of them $150, money they desperately needed to survive. "We were starving," Andy Summers recalled. "I remember counting pennies to buy a sandwich, deciding whether to eat or take the bus." Their unlikely trio formed from necessity, not friendship. Stewart Copeland, the American drummer with classical training whose father worked for the CIA. Andy Summers, the 35-year-old veteran guitarist who'd already played with Eric Burdon of The Animals. And Gordon Sumner. Sting, a former school teacher who got his nickname from a yellow and black striped sweater he wore to gigs. Their 1978 debut album Outlandos d'Amour was recorded during off hours when studio rates dropped to $35 an hour. Engineer Nigel Gray remembered. They'd come in at midnight and work until dawn, tracking songs between the regular bookings. The label showed little faith, pressing just 10,000 copies initially. Then, Roxanne hit radio, its distinctive reggae rock hybrid sound cutting through the punk and disco that dominated airwaves. Suddenly, they had a hit and everything accelerated. With each album, both their sound and bank accounts expanded exponentially. Regatta de Blanc, 1979. First #1 hit with Message in a Bottle, and gold records appearing on their walls. Zenyatta Mondatta, 1980. Tripled their audience, moving from clubs to arenas, and their first major touring profits. Ghost in the Machine, 1981. Expanded their sound with synthesizers while selling out venues across Europe and America. By 1983's Synchronicity, the Police had completed their transformation. The album sold over 8 million copies, in America alone. Every Breath You Take dominated radio for months. The scruffy club act had become polished global superstars playing stadiums across 5 continents. But as their stages grew larger, the distance between them grew too. What began with 3 men sharing the same van now featured separate limousines, separate hotels, and increasingly separate lives. Look at the songwriting credits on the Police's albums, and one name dominates: Sting. This wasn't just about artistic ego. It meant real money. In the music industry, songwriters earn royalties every time their song plays on radio, appears in a movie, or sells on an album. These royalties don't get split evenly among band members. They go to whoever wrote the song. Every Breath You Take alone generated about $2,000 in royalties every day. That's around $730,000 a year, flowing directly to Sting's bank account. That single song earned him more annually than what many Americans made in a decade. A music business insider described the financial disparity. Imagine playing a sold-out show, sweating on stage for 2 hours, then seeing your bandmate earn 10 times more than you for the same performance because he wrote the songs. That creates tension no band meeting can resolve. During a 1983 tour stop in Chicago, a telling scene unfolded. While Sting met with real estate agents about a luxury lakefront condo, Copeland and Summers were spotted at a local record store, browsing through the bins. The growing wealth gap created a visible division that couldn't be hidden. At breakfast in a Tokyo hotel during their 1981 tour, a witness observed Sting receiving a thick envelope, royalty statements showing millions in earnings, while his bandmates received notably thinner mail. The awkward silence that followed spoke volumes. As album sales multiplied into the millions, so did the financial imbalance. What began as creative collaboration gradually morphed into something else entirely. At first it was collaboration, Copeland explained, leaning forward in his chair, eyes intense. It became more and more compromise for him, and it got tougher and tougher for him to make those compromises. The drummer who had founded the band now found himself fighting just to be heard. During a particularly heated argument over King of Pain, Copeland repeatedly tried to suggest a different drum pattern. Each time, Sting talked over him until Copeland finally slammed his drumsticks down and walked out. Explaining to someone why their song isn't working is a bit like saying their girlfriend's ugly, Sting admitted, in a rare moment of self-awareness. It's a very personal thing. The rehearsal room became a battleground. During sessions for Synchronicity, Copeland brought in several new song ideas, including Miss Gradenko, which did make the album, and 3 others that didn't. After playing through them, Sting simply shook his head. "Not good enough," he said flatly, before turning back to his own material. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Andy Summers found himself caught in the middle of this power struggle. "I'd often end up as the mediator," he recalled. "But as time went on, there was less I could do to bridge the gap." The bitter irony? The Police's commercial success grew precisely because of Sting's songwriting talents, his gift for crafting memorable melodies and hooks that connected with millions. Yet this same success was poisoning their relationships. By 1983, the Police could no longer even breathe the same air. Walking into Montserrat's AIR studios during the Synchronicity recording sessions, you'd find something bizarre, a band recording in separate rooms. The tropical paradise setting, palm trees swaying outside the windows, ocean breezes wafting through the studio, contrasted starkly with the glacial tension inside. Stewart didn't have to be in the same room as Sting, producer Hugh Padgham recalled, gesturing to separate isolation booths. That would be tantamount to a fight breaking out at any point. This wasn't hyperbole. It was practical necessity. Small TV monitors connected the isolated musicians, allowing them to see but not touch each other. The control room became a demilitarized zone where Padgham would mediate conflicts through separate headphone channels. "I'd literally have different communication channels set up," Padgham explained. "I'd have to mute Sting's channel to talk to Stewart about a drum part, or else we'd have another explosion." Studio assistant Tom Allum described the atmosphere. "The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They'd go entire days without speaking directly to each other. We'd relay messages like, 'Sting thinks the tempo is dragging,' or 'Stewart wants another take.'" The physical separation wasn't enough to prevent violence. Before the Shea Stadium concert, tensions boiled over in the concrete backstage corridor. What began as an argument about the set list escalated quickly. It was like watching a pressure cooker explode, recalled roadie James Forrester, who witnessed the confrontation. Sting wanted to drop Synchronicity too, but Stewart insisted it stay in. Suddenly they were chest to chest, then shoving, then it just erupted. When the dust settled, Copeland had a fractured rib. He sat alone afterward, wincing while taping his torso, preparing to perform for 67,000 people while physically injured by his own bandmate. Stewart Copeland later captured the experience with a vivid image. Being in the Police was like wearing a Prada suit made out of barbed wire. Outwardly glamorous, privately painful, the fights weren't just physical. During the recording of Don't Stand So Close to Me 86, a simple snare, drum sample sparked a 2-week battle. For 14 days, these world-famous musicians argued over a single sound. Stewart wanted this sharp, attacking snare sound, remembers engineer Bob Clearmountain. Sting wanted something softer, more ambient. They brought in different engineers, tried different effects, all while the tension mounted. Nearly $10,000 in studio time spent arguing over a drum hit that lasted milliseconds. "I was never relaxed," Copeland admitted, drumming his fingers nervously on the table during a rare interview. "I had so much anxiety, I'd get physically sick before sessions." The cruel paradox: as they created their most commercially successful music, the Police could barely function as human beings in the same room. August 18, 1983. Shea Stadium vibrated with anticipation. 67,000 voices merged into a deafening roar as the Police took the stage. Red and blue lights swept across the massive crowd stretching to the horizon. The bass thundered through the concrete as they launched into Synchronicity 1. Midway through the set, something strange happened to Sting. While performing King of Pain, a calm clarity suddenly washed over him as he surveyed the ocean of upraised hands and waving lighters. "This is Everest," Sting later revealed, his voice dropping to almost a whisper during a 1986 interview. "I made the decision on stage that night. This is it. This is where this thing stops. Right now." It was a moment of stark contrast. While 67,000 fans thought they were witnessing a band ascending, Sting was mentally writing the final chapter. Outside, celebration; inside, termination. "I remember watching him during that show," recalls lighting director Mick Cleefield. Something changed in his expression midway through. He seemed almost peaceful, which was weird, because backstage before the show had been total chaos. The Synchronicity tour would continue for months after Sting's private decision, wrapping up with 105 shows across 3 continents through March 1984. The financial records tell the story of what they walked away from: over $400,000 for a single night in Greensboro, nearly $170,000 for a one-off show in Charleston. Concert promoter Barry Fay was stunned. When an act is selling 8 million albums and moving 36,000 units weekly months after release, they don't walk away. They double down. Most bands spend their entire careers trying to reach that level. Their manager, Miles Copeland, Stewart's brother and founder of IRS Records, implemented a media blackout about internal tensions. "Like the Beatles, our manager forced us to keep quiet," Andy Summers later revealed, shaking his head in disbelief. "He wanted us to carry on for 2 or 3 years." In a closed-door meeting at A&M Records headquarters in late 1983, executives reacted with disbelief to rumors of the split. According to former A&M Vice President Jeff Gold, there was genuine panic. The Police were a cornerstone of the label's financial projections. One executive literally put his head in his hands and said, "This can't be happening." The financial ripple effects extended far beyond the band. Concert promoters who had invested in relationships with the Police faced uncertainty. Tour manager Phil White described the aftermath. "Suddenly, 50 people, sound engineers, roadies, lighting techs, were out of jobs. These people had families, mortgages. Some had been with the band for years." Their 2007 to 2008 reunion tour provided concrete evidence of what they walked away from: over $358 million in revenue from 152 shows. That figure represents not just what a reunion could earn, but the financial trajectory they abandoned at their peak. For Sting, sitting alone in his dressing room after that fateful Shea Stadium show, the decision wasn't about money. Wiping stage makeup from his face, he realized that no amount of financial incentive could repair what success had broken. The morning after the Police's final performance in March 1984, 3 musicians who once created magic together woke up to entirely different futures. Sting wasted no time establishing his solo career. By 1985, his debut album, The Dream of the Blue Turtles, sold nearly 10 million copies, immediately proving he didn't need his former bandmates to succeed. "I wanted to work with jazz musicians, to explore different rhythms and harmonies," Sting told Rolling Stone. The Police format was limiting, wonderful but limiting. Within his NYC penthouse apartment, far from the modest London flats they once shared, Sting could watch his bank account grow exponentially. His 1987 album, Nothing Like the Sun, went triple platinum. Fields of Gold and Englishman in New York became signature solo hits that rivaled his Police classics. By 2022, he had accumulated a staggering $550 million fortune built on 79 million album sales. Andy Summers took a different path. The sophisticated guitarist recorded multiple solo albums like XYZ and Mysterious Barricades, exploring instrumental and jazz-influenced territories from his modest Los Angeles studio. While his 1987 collaboration with Robert Fripp was critically acclaimed, commercial success proved elusive. His albums sold thousands, not millions. "I pursued artistic fulfillment over commercial appeal," Summers explained, sitting in his home studio surrounded by vintage guitars and equipment. "That's a choice you make. Sometimes I'd see Sting on the cover of magazines while I was playing 500-seat jazz clubs. But I was happy with what I was creating." Stewart Copeland reinvented himself in Hollywood. From his converted garage studio filled with exotic percussion instruments from his global travels, the intense drummer composed soundtracks for Francis Ford Coppola's Rumblefish and the hit series The Equalizer. He formed new bands, Animal Logic with jazz bassist Stanley Clarke and Oysterhead with Primus's Les Claypool and Fish's Trey Anastasio. That kept him creatively satisfied but nowhere near his former commercial heights. The financial divide between former bandmates created an awkward dynamic whenever their paths crossed at industry events. At the 1992 Grammy Awards, Sting arrived in a limousine with security guards, while Summers came in a taxi. During one backstage encounter at a charity event in 1997, the tension was still palpable as they exchanged brief, formal greetings before quickly separating. The 2007 to 2008 reunion tour temporarily leveled the playing field. For 152 shows spanning 14 months, the Police generated over $358 million. Concrete proof of what could have been. Andy Summers reportedly earned around $1 million per night during this nostalgic return, more than many of his solo albums had generated in their entire sales history. Behind the scenes, the reunion showed how little had changed. While not openly hostile, they maintained separate dressing rooms and rarely socialized off stage. "We were more professional," Copeland noted, but the same personalities were still there. Yet for Sting, the reunion was merely nostalgic. "At the time, I labeled the tour an exercise in nostalgia," he reflected. "That was simply how I felt and is still how I feel today." The final chapter in this financial tale came in 2022, when Sting sold his entire song catalog, including the Police material, to Universal Music Publishing Group for $300 million. This massive transaction showed the long-term value of musical ownership, something Sting had maintained since the band's dissolution. And so, the Police made the rare decision to quit at their highest point, walking away from guaranteed millions. "I think it gives you a competitive energy, a buzz," Sting explained years later, sitting in his Tuscan villa surrounded by sun-drenched vineyards. "There comes a point where it just gets in the way of the creative process and you're dealing with ego as opposed to actual musical ideas." He believed they should quit at the high point of the curve rather than fade away. Music critic David Fricke called it one of the few times a major band walked away with their legacy intact before diluting what made them special. The Police never released a bad album, never experienced declining sales, and never became a nostalgia act performing diminished versions of their hits. Their musical innovations remained influential for decades. That distinctive police sound, Summer's chiming guitar effects, Copeland's complex reggae-influenced rhythms, and Sting's melodic bass and vocals inspired countless bands that followed. U2, The Killers, and Radiohead all acknowledged their debt to the Police's pioneering approach. Andy Summers reflected with mixed emotions, "I knew that this was inevitable, that it was always in the script. The question was when it would surface." Though he admitted, "I regret we never paid it off with a last tour." Stewart Copeland gained perspective over time. The friction that tore us apart was the same friction that created those songs. Without the creative tension, would the music have been as good? I doubt it. In 2003, when the Police were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they briefly reunited to perform 3 songs. For a few minutes, the magic returned. Proof that their chemistry remained powerful, if volatile. The Police's story reveals a timeless truth that applies far beyond music. Sometimes walking away at your peak preserves not just your sanity, but your legacy. Success can destroy the very chemistry that created it. In the end, they chose themselves over being the biggest band in the world, because the cost of staying together had become too high to bear. But the music they created during their brief, explosive time together continues to resonate decades later, perhaps all the more powerful because they knew when to stop. When